Next up, they had a whole pile of old oscilloscopes sitting around, and condition unknown. So I took a chance on one of them. I looked through all the ones that were there. They were mostly Tektronix scopes, but this one caught my eye. So this is the one I decided to grab. I probably could have had all of them for like probably $10 a piece, but the reality is, it's an old scope, condition unknown. But the reason why I grabbed this one was because I noticed that this is a model 2236. I noticed it has a digital readout up here, and apparently that is a built-in multimeter and frequency counter. This looks like Tektronix answer to the famous Sencore SC61 waveform analyzer. Sencore called theirs, they didn't want to call it an oscilloscope, they called it a waveform analyzer because the things that they built into it, which basically was, previously, if you were doing troubleshooting, you would want to look at the waveform with the scope probe. But if you wanted to know what the DC voltage was at that same point, there was a way to do it with the scope, but typically what people would do is they would turn to a voltmeter. So you would put the scope probe down and pick up your voltmeter and test for the voltage at that point. And what if you wanted to know what the frequency was, well, again, there was a way to do it through calculation using the time-based setting, okay, but a much quicker way would be to put a frequency counter on it. And what Sencore did was Sencore basically took a frequency counter and a voltmeter and stuck it all inside the scope so that you could touch the probe to one point, see the waveform, see the DC voltage present, and see the frequency of the waveform that is present. Furthermore, they also added some other little tricks. If you had a composite waveform that had multiple parts to it, they gave you a ability to actually isolate part of that waveform and just look at the frequency of that. So like if you had a little bit of a ripple on a waveform, if you zoomed in on that ripple, you could actually see what the frequency of the ripple was, or something to that effect. That was not really probably a good example for good use of that feature, but it was there, so that's why they called it a waveform analyzer. So anyways, apparently this Tektronix had something similar to that. So let's see if this thing is dead. Okay, and this should be power. Look at that. I thought it was dead, but it just took a second for it to boot up. Wow, that's great. We got two traces. Yeah, we got dirty controls. I can see that. Let's see, intensity. Well, actually, was able to do some tests on this thing, and it seems to be actually working pretty good. And one other thing I discovered is this is not like the Sencore waveform analyzer, because the thing that Sencore figured out how to do, which apparently Tektronix didn't, is that although I can actually just use the test frequency coming out here. Alright, so we've got a nice waveform there, and if I switch this over, I can actually measure the frequency. So the frequency counter works perfectly fine. However, I tried putting a DC voltage on here, switching this to DC voltage, and wasn't getting anything. So I thought, well, maybe that's not working. And then I happened to spot right here that in small print it actually says from side panel. And I was like, oh, side panel? Look what we got. A couple of banana jacks sitting over here. They stuck, basically all they did was they stuck a multimeter inside this box here. So you still would have to drop this probe and pick up your probes that you have plugged into the side here to do DC voltage checks. So I just got this battery I had laying here, and it's reading 1.4 volts. This battery's dead, obviously, but I checked that against my little handheld multimeter right here, and it's also reading 1.4 volts. So it looks like the built-in voltmeter, DC voltmeter, is working. And then there's also appears to be a continuity resistance, built-in resistance continuity checker here. So let's see. So this is a diode check. Appears to be working. I think that this switch is sticking, but I think this is actually a temperature. Yeah, all right. This had the ability to plug in an optional probe, and it becomes a temp probe. And then if we press, I think this, no, it's got a little diagram there showing that what looks to be like a audible sound. I don't know how to make that work though. Well, I'm not going to worry about it. Main thing is that this appears to be a scope that just needs to be cleaned up. Maybe have some of the switches cleaned, but otherwise seems to work perfectly fine. That was a nice score, unexpected.